Holes is a children's book written by Louis Sacker in 1998, which was adapted into a Disney movie in 2003. While the target audience of this story is children, Holes has proven to have a unique staying power with adult audiences that transcends basic nostalgia. I think there are a few reasons for this. For one, the movie just has a stellar cast. Eartha Kitt, Sigourney Weaver, Patricia Arquette, Jon Voight, a young Shia LaBeouf breathes a lot of life into the main character, and Tim Blake Nelson, Dulé Hill, and Cleo Thomas really steal the show. Also, Henry Winkler's in it.
I love Fonzie.
Another reason for Hole's timelessness is its underlying themes. From poverty to race to the American criminal justice system. And although Holes doesn't address a lot of these themes directly, it is through the use of metaphor that Holes is able to ruminate on these real-world issues, specifically how all of them intersect and fester into a kind of omnipresent torment that is felt not only by millions of people, but also their descendants. Holes is a story about curses, specifically, curses manifested by injustice and felt by the descendants of both the victims and perpetrators of those injustices. These curses are not just the literary devices Sacker uses to emphasize themes and draw parallels between characters, but also deeply evocative metaphors for real-world psychological phenomena that are every bit as devastating and pervasive as their supernatural counterparts. Holes opens when Stanley Yelnats IV is walking home from school one day when a pair of shoes fall on his head seemingly out of nowhere. He's later arrested for stealing those shoes, which turn out to have been donated by a famous baseball player to a charity auction at a nearby homeless shelter. With his father being a floundering inventor yet to make a breakthrough, Stanley's family can't afford a lawyer, and despite his innocence, the judge convinces him to plead guilty for a supposedly lighter alternative sentence. Instead of wasting away in prison, he could serve his time at Camp Green Lake. Stanley blames being in the wrong place at the wrong time on the Yelnats family curse, which started 5 generations ago when his great-great-grandfather Elia Yelnats broke a promise he made to an old mystic named Madame Zeroni. Elia was a farmer who needed bigger livestock, so Madame Zeroni gave him one of her pigs and told him that if he carries the pig up the mountain and sings a specific lullaby as it drinks from the mountain's river, the pig will grow stronger. In exchange for this advice and gift, Elia agrees to carry Madame Zeroni herself up the mountain and sing the lullaby as she drinks from the river.
So I can get strong too.
After getting what he wants, however, Elia abandons her, and instead of carrying her up the mountain, he moves to America and eventually starts a family, cursing both himself and his descendants. He would sing Zeroni's lullaby to his son, which would become a Yelnats family tradition. Despite this apparent curse on his family, Elia's son, Stanley Yelnats I, seemed to be doing very well for himself, making a fortune on the stock market. His good luck ran out, however, when he was traveling with that fortune and was robbed at gunpoint by a bandit who took everything from him and left him for dead in the middle of the desert. Although Stanley I survived by what he cryptically described as taking refuge on God's thumb, the Yelnats family's subsequent poverty is seen as the first example of the curse taking a toll on the family through bad luck, with the arrest of Stanley IV being the most recent example. While feeling the pain and ramifications of an ancestor's transgressions or victimhood is a classic example of a supernatural curse, it also mimics a real-world psychological phenomenon called intergenerational trauma. Intergenerational trauma refers to the physical and psychological symptoms of trauma responses being passed down through subsequent generations. Trauma responses manifest in many different ways, but a surprisingly common manifestation of trauma is unconsciously reliving traumatic events from the past, basically repeating history. As therapist Mark Wolin explains in his book It Didn't Start With You, traumatic reenactment, or repetition compulsion as Freud calls it, is an attempt for the unconscious to replay what's unresolved, so we can get it right. This unconscious drive to relive past events could be one of the mechanisms at work when families repeat unresolved traumas in future generations. Freud's contemporary Carl Jung also believed that what remains unconscious does not dissolve, but rather resurfaces in our lives as fate or fortune. Upon arrival at Camp Green Lake, Stanley sees that the lake has long since been dried completely. A century-long drought has transformed what was once a massive body of water and a lakeside town into over 100 miles of dilapidated, lifeless desert that is completely uninhabitable, with the exception of some very early 2000s CGI venomous lizards. He also learns that Camp Green Lake is now a juvenile prison labor camp run by Warden Walker. Walker requires each prisoner to dig a 5-foot deep by 5-foot wide hole in the ground every day. The boys are told that they're only made to dig in order to build character, but if they just so happen to find something while they dig, to present it to Warden Walker immediately and they'll get the rest of the day off.
You take a bad boy, make him dig holes all day in the hot sun, and it turns him into a good boy. That's our philosophy here at Camp Green Lake.
All the boys in Camp Green Lake have their own given nicknames. Among them are X-Ray, because his glasses look like X-ray specs, Armpit, because he doesn't shower, and Zero.
Because there's nothing going on in his stupid little head.
In reality, of course, Zero didn't actually lack intelligence, just opportunity. Growing up homeless with his mom, he never had the chance to go to school or learn how to read. After his first few days of digging, Stanley finds an old lipstick tube with the initials KB. X-Ray takes it from Stanley and the next day says he found it in his hole and gets to take the rest of the day off. It turns out KB stands for Kate Barlow, who was a school teacher at Camp Green Lake over 100 years ago, back when it was a proper lake rather than a desert. Kate and a kind-hearted, charismatic onion farmer named Sam had taken a liking to each other, often trading each other a bushel of Sam's onions for a jar of Kate's spiced peaches. Eventually, this culminated with them kissing. Unfortunately, someone saw them, and because Sam was black and Kate was white, Kate's schoolhouse was burned down, and Sam was murdered. It hasn't rained in Camp Green Lake since. You can't have an intellectually honest conversation about intergenerational trauma without talking about racialized violence like Sam's murder. Intergenerational trauma was originally discovered in the children of Holocaust survivors. Systemic violence, discrimination, and racialized atrocity are intrinsically connected to the concept. This aspect of intergenerational trauma is called historical trauma theory. As Dr. Sidney Hankerson et al. Explains in the American Journal of Psychiatry, historical trauma theory postulates that the psychological and emotional consequences of mass traumatic experiences can be transmitted to subsequent generations through physiological, environmental, and social pathways. This transmission results in an intergenerational cycle of trauma responses, including general medical, social, and psychological. Just as the reverberations of Sam's lynching scarred the land of Camp Green Lake, rendering it lifeless and barren, the reverberations of all past racialized atrocities scarred the psyches of people here and now. With nothing left of her civilian life, Kate gets a gun, kills the sheriff who allowed Sam's lynching, and starts robbing banks and stagecoaches under the moniker Kissin' Kate. One of the people she robbed, and one of the very few she left alive, was Stanley Yelnats I. Stanley's family's poverty was a direct result of Sam's murder. I'm aware of how outlandish the concept of intergenerational trauma sounds. There's a reason it fits so well onto the concept of a supernatural curse. How is it possible for someone to be traumatized by something they weren't even alive to experience? The leading theory on this lies in epigenetics. At a very simplified level, epigenetics is the study of the cellular modification of gene expression. Epigenetic marks are chemicals that can determine to what extent certain aspects of one's genetics are either amplified or suppressed. If genetics are notes on a piece of sheet music, epigenetics would be the dynamics. In musical notation, dynamics dictate the volume at which you play specific sections of sheet music. They don't change the underlying notes, but they can drastically alter how those notes are expressed. And like in music, the performance of certain genetic instructions is often affected by the environment that performance takes place in. Even if you're playing the same song, you're not going to play it the same way in a fancy restaurant as you would in a crowded bar. Not only can epigenetics be influenced by environmental factors like trauma, they're also heritable. This is how some scientists think that symptoms of trauma can be passed down to subsequent generations. This potentially leads to some truly incredible implications for the scientific legitimacy of not only feeling the pain or guilt of one's ancestors, but also, through traumatic reenactment, repeating their history. As Stanley and Zero become friends, Stanley starts helping Zero learn how to read in exchange for helping him dig every day. While teaching him how to spell his full name, Stanley realizes that Zero isn't just a demeaning nickname, but also a play on his real last name, Zeroni. Hector Zeroni, Zero's real name, is a descendant of the woman Stanley's great-great-grandfather wronged all those years ago. One day, after extensive verbal abuse from camp staff, Zero finally reaches his breaking point, hitting one of them over the head with a shovel and running off into the desert. Warden Walker then destroys Zero's records, expecting him to die. After a few days of Zero being nowhere to be found, Stanley runs off after him. Eventually, after traversing miles and miles of desert, Stanley comes across an old upturned rowboat and finds Zero resting in its shade. It turns out Zero has been surviving on 100-year-old jars of spiced peaches, the exact same peaches Kate traded Sam for bushels of onions. It was Sam's boat, named after his donkey. Stanley tries to convince Zero to come back to camp with him, but Zero refuses. While trying to convince him, something catches Stanley's eye.
What does that look like to you?
As they make their way up the mountain, Zero gets sicker and sicker due to the spoiled peaches. Too weak to walk on his own, Stanley has to carry him. I want to take some time here to compare the actions of what Stanley is doing to the actions of Warden Walker. They're completely different characters, but they were, in one aspect, born into similar circumstances. While the entire town of Camp Green Lake was responsible for Sam's killing, the singular man who actually murdered Sam was the warden's grandfather. After years of robbing banks and stagecoaches, Kate buries everything she stole somewhere in the desert. While laying on Sam's boat, she's confronted by Walker, Sam's killer. Kate outdraws him, but realizes that the poverty his own actions created, coupled with the knowledge that untold riches will remain just under his nose but out of his reach for the rest of his life, is a fate worse than anything one of her bullets could give him. So she gives him one final prophecy before taking her own life.
You, your children, and your children's children will dig for the next 100 years, and you will never find it.
And so seals not just this racist murderer's fate, but the fate of his descendants. Sam's killer spends the rest of his life digging for Kate's treasure in vain, and passes down that obsession and cruelty by forcing his young granddaughter, who would grow up to become the warden, to dig with him. Kate's treasure is the real reason Warden Walker is having the children of Camp Green Lake dig. Stanley and Warden Walker being affected by these curses highlights one of the most glossed over yet important aspects of intergenerational trauma, that being, the symptoms of intergenerational trauma do not descend only to the lineage of the traumatized, but also the lineage of the traumatizer. While historically the descendants of oppressors are far, far more privileged than the descendants of the oppressed, the examination of one's current actions within the context of the injustices committed by one's ancestors can prove an illuminating force in the exploration of why and how one finds themselves complicit in current systemic injustice. As different as Stanley and Warden Walker are, these are two white characters who are born into legacies stained by injustices their ancestors committed against people of color. But one is trying to help heal that pain, and the other is perpetuating it. This is what Dr. Resmaa Menakem, in his book My Grandmother's Hands, refers to as clean pain and dirty pain, the former being foundational to the healing process and halting the repetition of history. As Dr. Menakem explains in the book, trauma is not destiny. It can look like destiny when people choose to blow their trauma through others, but when you make a deliberate choice not to pass on your trauma to others, that choice begins to mend some of the trauma. It changes what looks like a destiny of dirty pain into an experience of clean pain. Clean pain has a healing and transformative capacity that dirty pain does not. Although they may seem contradictory at first, I agree with both the sentiments of Menakem and Young regarding the resurfacing of trauma as destiny. While I do believe that the trauma of past generations is fated to manifest in our lives, the actions we take in response are up to us. Traumatic reenactment, at the end of the day, is your subconscious trying to make things right. The one benefit of repeating history is that it provides us with an opportunity to do better. With this concept of clean and dirty pain, the warden and her labor camp come into full context. Her kind of evil is not generic, it's generational. Just as her grandfather made her dig, she forces an entire camp of children to dig for the same thing, not only perpetuating the personal trauma she endured as a child, but also perpetuating the same kind of racialized violence her grandfather inflicted on Sam. The irony of this is that Kate's treasure is a symbol of spite towards the people now looking for it. It's an accumulation of riches gathered during the grief-induced rampage of a person who spent the entire rest of her life punishing the system that brutally killed an innocent man solely for the crime of being black. And now a new generation of cogs in that same machine are desperately trying to find riches gathered exclusively out of hatred for the system they represent. Don't forget, the same criminal justice system that finds it fitting to subjugate children into forced, unpaid labor is the same system that found it within the law to murder Sam. Just as the trauma of the past lives on in present generations, so too do the institutions responsible for that trauma live on in our current system. After a long, arduous hike up the mountain, Stanley finally gets to the top of God's Thumb and discovers a small reservoir of groundwater, not only the same groundwater his great-grandfather had found after Kate robbed him, but the same groundwater that Sam used to grow his onions, which even after 100 years, were continuing to grow wild. As Zero drank from the stream and grew stronger, Stanley sang himself the lullaby that his great-great-grandfather had promised to sing all those years ago to Madame Zeroni, lifting the Yelnats family curse. Zero recovers after a few days of resting on the mountain, and then comes clean about how he was actually the one who inadvertently caused their families to reunite, having taken those shoes and throwing them over the bridge in a panic when he heard police sirens. Stanley expresses gratitude for being able to finally make things right with the Zeroni family, and tells Hector that they should take advantage of their newfound luck in order to dig one last hole. It turns out, X-Ray making Stanley give him Kate's lipstick tube may have actually been a blessing in disguise, because it was X-Ray's hole and not Stanley's that the warden turned into an excavation site in search of the treasure. Stanley and Zero sneak back into Camp Green Lake, find the hole in which Stanley originally found the lipstick, and after more digging, find the treasure, along with more early 2000s CGI lizards. Meanwhile, thanks to the lifting of the Yelnats family curse, Stanley's dad finally hits it big with a new invention which lifts them out of poverty. Stanley's family immediately uses their newfound wealth to send a high-powered attorney to Camp Green Lake who raises hell, ultimately securing both Stanley and Zero's freedom, ownership of the treasure they found, closure of Camp Green Lake, and the arrest of the warden and her staff. And when Warden Walker, the granddaughter of the man who murdered Sam, finally faces justice for perpetuating his legacy of cruelty, for dealing in such dirty pain, it finally starts to rain again in Camp Green Lake. On the face of it, this seems like the standard happy ending one would expect from a children's book or a Disney Channel movie. Rewatching and rereading Holes as an adult, however, I can't help but notice a morbid parallel between the closure of Camp Green Lake and the closing of a real-life prison labor camp, as well as the politics behind it. Martin Tappert was a 22-year-old white man born into a wealthy family in North Dakota. In 1922, he was charged with vagrancy after allegedly riding a train without a ticket while traveling in Florida. Not having enough cash on hand to pay the $25 fee, he was thrown in prison. Tappert immediately let his parents know through a letter that he was in trouble and needed $50 to be released. His family had wired more than enough money to the sheriff's office just 6 days later, but the sheriff returned the money unopened. The state of Florida had already sold Tappert through a program called Convict Leasing, a practice where state governments sold the forced labor of prisoners to private companies. Tappert was sold to a work camp owned by Putnam Lumber Company, where he would end up dying shortly thereafter. Putnam initially said that Tappert had died of fever, but thanks to the eyewitness account of another prisoner, it was ultimately proven that he was murdered by a man named Walter Higginbotham, who beat him to death with a 5-foot-long, 7.5-pound rawhide strap. At first, I heard screams, which grew weaker and weaker, said Mrs. Walter Lyles, who had been fishing near the camp. Finally, there was only the sound of the lash. Tappert was buried in an unmarked grave on the property that has gone unfound to this day. There was national outrage. The Tabbert family sued Putnam. The lawmakers from their home state pressured the Florida state government into arresting Tabbert's killer, who a jury ultimately found guilty of second-degree murder. And in just a year, convict leasing in Florida was abolished. To state this in plain terms, as if it weren't obvious enough already, the outrage and pressure that ultimately led to the abolition of convict leasing in Florida was due entirely to Martin Tabbert being white, and his family being wealthy. The horrific violence to which he was subjected was standard treatment of black impoverished prisoners. Convict leasing was a means of perpetuating slavery after the Civil War. To quote the Equal Justice Initiative, the 13th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, ratified in 1865, prohibited slavery and involuntary servitude, but explicitly exempted those convicted of crime. In response, Southern state legislatures quickly passed black codes, new laws that explicitly applied only to black people and subjected them to criminal prosecution for offenses such as loitering, breaking curfew, vagrancy, having weapons, and not carrying proof of employment, crafted to ensnare black people and return them to chains. As you may have noticed, vagrancy was the crime Tabbert ended up in prison for. Tabbert had been swept up by a system that was designed almost exclusively to continue the subjugation of black people. Tabbert's murderer admitted to flogging 10 prisoners per week. It was his job. The racialized nature of this violence was so blatant that the rawhide strap used to murder Tabbert was literally referred to as a black auntie. Tabbert's grave may have never been found, but in searching for it, people found others. A subsequent investigation into another labor camp found at least 9 murders. Tabbert's was not the only grave in a prison labor camp, but due to his race and his wealth, it was the only grave people bothered looking for. I can't help but see some parallels in the broad strokes of Tabbert and Stanley's stories. Both were imprisoned for no reason, both were forced to work manual labor, and although Tabbert tragically died, the wealth of their white families is ultimately what dismantled their respective labor camps, despite black people and other marginalized groups having suffered those same conditions and that same violence, with no mainstream outrage on their behalf to be found. All it took was for the wrong kind of person, a white person with both social and literal capital, to be mistakenly folded into a system of abuse for that system to fall under any kind of meaningful scrutiny. It should go without saying how these systems feed into intergenerational trauma and historical trauma theory. Injustices and the trauma they produce can haunt us, both sociologically and epigenetically, so long as they go unaddressed. It's like a splinter. No matter how many layers of skin heal over it, the root problem is still there and only gets worse so long as it remains. Access to mental health care, or any healthcare in general, is also so segregated by both race and class that vast oceans of intergenerational trauma continue to go unaddressed and wreak havoc on the lives of those suffering from the experiences of their ancestors, and repeating history without even realizing it. The only thing you can do about the past is learn and heal, and while those are important, we also need to focus on the only period of time in which we can do anything, which is the present. Because the biggest problem here is that this trauma and the systems that create it are not quarantined to the past. The criminal justice system is not just rife with practices like these. It was built on and for practices like these. In real life, prison labor isn't used to search for symbolic buried treasure, but rather in the supply chains of products you see every day, such as the manufacturing of any and all textiles, from lingerie to military-grade body armor, metalwork, equipment assembly, and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of agricultural goods, including the literal picking of cotton. All of this is derived from essentially free labor bought and sold legally through a prison industry that brings billions of dollars of profits to major international corporations, as well as prominent elected officials who in turn are incentivized through lobbying to become harder on crime, which usually just means strengthening the school-to-prison pipeline, over-policing disenfranchised communities, and further criminalizing addiction, poverty, and mental illness to funnel as many people as possible into this system that trades in free labor. Although capital S slavery may have been abolished, the slave catchers have stuck around, and the nets that they cast have only grown wider with taxpayer money. Taxpayers, by the way, who are still so steadfast in their belief that prisoners don't deserve human rights, that during the 2024 election, when Proposition 6 was on the ballot in California, which sought to ban forced prison labor, it lost by almost 1 million votes. When I was a kid, I naively assumed that Camp Green Lake, like the intergenerational curses that haunted the characters, didn't actually exist in real life, but it turns out the most unrealistic thing about holes are those stupid lizards. Holes is a story about curses, specifically curses manifested by injustice and felt by the descendants of both the victims and perpetrators of those injustices. The more I learned about intergenerational trauma as an adult, the deeper this movie and book resonated with me, and my appreciation for Sacker's magnum opus only grew. I think the reason behind this is the simplicity of what Holes as a story demonstrates. For all the psychological, neurological, and genetic research that has gone into our understanding of intergenerational trauma, the bottom line is this: only justice will bring peace. We see an impoverished, wrongfully imprisoned child subjugated to forced labor in brutal conditions, and despite the fact that keeping his head down and not causing trouble is his best shot at survival, he breaks the rules. He runs off into the unknown and uninhabitable, risking his own life, and fights like hell for the well-being and freedom of his friend.
I can't leave without Hector.
While the justice of doing the right thing here and now cannot undo injustices of the past, it can help alleviate the suffering caused by those injustices in the present. In the United States criminal justice system, injustices are not accidents, they're industrialized. Despite whatever use companies find for the cheap labor it provides, sociologically, the US prison system is first and foremost a trauma factory. And no matter how many breakthroughs or resources we make to combat and heal from intergenerational trauma, healing is an impossible task so long as the injustice that causes that trauma persists. And the current criminal justice system we have is built on the bones of slave catchers and plantation owners with the purpose of maintaining class hierarchy and white supremacy. Interpersonal acts of justice, like that of Stanley and Hector, are priceless, but so long as we have a system that trades in brutality and exploitation compulsory to slave labor, we will find ourselves in an eternal losing battle when it comes to healing intergenerational trauma and halting the repetition of history. I sincerely believe that one day we can break these curses and have rain once again fall on scarred land, but so long as we collectively allow the current system to remain, we're just digging ourselves a deeper hole.